60 seconds or so before we actually start, because I know people will trickle in. And so we want to make sure that we can get everybody at the beginning. So just hang tight for a minute and we'll be with you. Okay, well, listen, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Miles Rappaport, and I am the Senior Practice Fellow in American Democracy at the Ash Center. And before we begin our program, I want to start with a few announcements on the Ash Center's behalf. First, the Ash Center would like to acknowledge that the land on which Harvard sits has been the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people and a place which has long served as a meeting place among nations. Secondly, I want to say that our next event, which will be next Monday, March 7th at 4 o'clock, will be a discussion with Donald Cohen, the author of the new book, The Privatization of Everything: How the Plunder of Public Goods Transformed America and How We Can Fight Back. And the other thing I want to say is what a pleasure it is for me personally to have Michael Kazin with us today. We were undergraduates here at Harvard over 50 years ago. We were activist colleagues and fast friends, and we have remained so for over 50 years. I have admired his work immensely, which is always at the intersection of social movements, the political process, and the biggest moments of American history. So I'm delighted to have him, quote, on campus today to continue that tradition, talking about his newest book, What It Took to Win: A History of the Democratic Party. And now let me introduce our moderator for today, Professor Randall Kennedy. Randall Kennedy is the Michael R. Klein Professor at Harvard Law School. He served as a law clerk for Judge J. Skelly Wright of the United States Court of Appeals, and also for Mr. Civil Rights, Justice Thurgood Marshall of the United States Supreme Court. He's a member of the Bar of the District of Columbia and the Supreme Court of the United States. And as an author, he was awarded the 1998 Robert F. Kennedy Book Award for Race, Crime, and the Law. He writes for a wide range of publications, and I am proud to sit with him on the board of the American Prospect magazine, where his recent cover story on the attack on the teaching of America's true racial history was quite extraordinary, and I recommend it to all of you. Randy, I pass the microphone over to you.
Thank you so much, Miles. I appreciate that, and I appreciate this forum. I really look forward to being in conversation with the guest of the hour, Michael Kazin. I've admired Michael Kazin over the years. Very well educated, went to Harvard, Stanford PhD. Very distinguished activist intellectual. I guess I know Michael Kazin most through his work with the wonderful magazine, Dissent magazine, which he co-edited for a number of years. And then there are his books, and books are very difficult projects. They're difficult projects, and they warrant attention. And I want to read off the books that Michael Kazin has written. Barons of Labor, the San Francisco Building Trades and Union Power in the Progressive Era. The Populist Persuasion in American History. America Divided, the Civil War of the 1960s, which he wrote with Maurice Isserman. A Godly Hero, The Life of William Jennings Bryan. American Dreamers, How the Left Changed a Nation. War Against War, The American Fight for Peace, 1914 to 1918. And then the book that's really going to serve as the focus of our discussion today, What It Took to Win: A History of the Democratic Party, that has just been published. So again, I'm very happy to be here with Michael Kazin, and I'd like to kick things off actually by just reading from the first two paragraphs of his wonderful new book. Here goes. This book tells the story of how the oldest mass party in the world contended for power and what its leaders did with it when they won. The aims and methods of Democrats have evolved inevitably over the past 2 centuries, but one theme has endured. They have insisted that the economy should benefit the ordinary working person, whether farmer or wage earner, and that governments should institute policies to make that possible. When Democrats made a convincing appeal to the economic interests of the many, they usually celebrated victory at the polls. It took a hideously long time for the self-proclaimed party of the people to welcome the support and fight for the needs of Americans whose skin was not white and whose gender was not male. For the first century of its existence, the Democratic Party was, in fact, if not official doctrine, an organization that solicited the votes of white men only and neglected or disparaged everyone else. During the 19th century, its leaders carried out the forced removal of Native Americans from their ancestral lands, defended slavery and allowed it to expand, did their best to sabotage Reconstruction, and constructed the brutal Jim Crow order that followed. They also lagged behind Republicans in endorsing women's suffrage. Not until the 1930s did the party at the national level begin tentatively to embrace an interracial constituency. The change was a long time in coming and did not result in the passage of strong civil rights laws until almost 3 decades later. The liberal journalist Michael Tomasky sums up this benighted record. The pre-FDR Democrats, a horrible party. So, Professor Kazin, take it from there. Annotate those first 2 paragraphs.
Great. Well, first of all, I want to thank Professor Kennedy for agreeing to do this. We have a mutual admiration society. I've learned quite a bit from his works and from our conversations over the last few years. And thanks to Miles, who I've been friends with, as he said, through 2/3 of my life, and I hope many more years to come. And thanks also to the Ash Center for sponsoring this. It's a real pleasure to be back at Harvard, so to speak, even though I'm sitting in my house in Washington, D.C. So, well, obviously, what you describe there is a paradox. On the one hand, Democrats, as the name has it, strive to be the party of the people. They strive to be the party of the majority, the party which supports the interests and the desires, not always the same thing, of the vast majority of the people. And I think that rhetorically and in many of their policies, they try to do that. At the same time, for much of the history, they were what some political scientists call a Herrenvolk democracy. That is a democracy for white men only, a democracy that depended in its doctrine and in many ways in its appeal too on being a racist party. At the same time, I think when some of the battles that they were fighting, for example, the battle against rechartering the Second Bank of the United States under Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, battles for a more flexible currency under William Jennings Bryan, and in some ways Woodrow Wilson, were battles for what I call, and I borrow this term from Harvard history professor Elizabeth Cohen, also a good friend of mine. They were striving to create what I would call a moral capitalism. That is a capitalism which strive to help the great majority of Americans who are, as the first page, which Professor Kennedy quoted, for most American history, wage earners, all small farmers. So, this is the paradox. In some ways, the paradox of American history, after all. The paradox of institutions from the Declaration of Independence forward, which espouse wonderful ideals, but fall quite short of realizing them. But the Democratic Party as an institution is something I think bears a lot of examination. I try to do some of that in this book. Historians don't really spend much time looking at institutions. We look at movements a lot, we look at individuals, we look at social trends and cultural trends, but very few times we look at institutions which do so much to shape people's lives, whether they're cabinet departments or state governments or political parties like the Democratic Party. So my aim in this book was to understand the evolution of this, I think, crucial institution for American democracy, and understand how, when it dominated the American political scene, it was able to do that, which I think has a lot to do not just with its organization, but also with its ideology, what I call moral capitalism, but also how it struggled to live up to that ideal, if you will, an ideal that, of course, for a long time, those who led the party felt they were struggling, they were living up to, because they thought the only people that really mattered in the American polity were white men and perhaps members of their families. But one of the most interesting things, I think, actually, and I won't go on too long with this soliloquy, but I think it was the ideology of moral capitalism which enabled Democrats to be the party of most unionists, trade unionists in the early and mid 20th century. And actually it was the trade unions, as I talk about in the chapter on the New Deal and World War II, which I think pushed, if you will, in many ways compelled the Democrats to become more interracial party, because the unions, especially the unions of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, were the first institutions connected to the Democratic Party, which said, we're not going to, go for Jim Crow anymore. We're going to sign people up regardless of race. Now, not to say they were perfect institutions, but they were institutions which were becoming essential to the Democratic Party, not just at the national level, but in many industrial states as well. And without those unions, the Democratic Party probably would not have become the dominant union it was during the period of the New Deal order from the 1930s up until the late 1960s. So despite the terrible party that my friend Mike Tomasky, who's editor of the New Republic now, used to be editor of the American Prospect, talks about in a book he published a couple of years ago, I think even in that terrible party, even the bowels of that terrible party, you might argue I would argue the possibility of a better party were germinating.
I want to get to the 20th century, but a little bit more about earlier times. You begin your book on an interesting note, prologue, a useful myth, and you talk about Thomas Jefferson. Tell us a bit about the myths involved with Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Party.
Well, the myth, which Democrats still some support and certainly talked about, articulated for a long time, was that Thomas Jefferson was the founder of the party. It was a Jeffersonian Democratic Party. And the part of that which is true is that those who actually founded the mass Democratic Party in the 1820s, people like Martin Van Buren, Andrew Jackson, various folks from Virginia, especially in upper New York State, like Van Buren, they saw Jefferson as their inspiration. But if we're talking about the founding of a party like the parties we think about today, part of a competitive party system with a mass press, adhering to the legitimacy of the other party, though some ways our past president has thrown some doubt on that legitimacy, at least how much he respects it. But nevertheless, throughout most of US history, as you know, the party, there were two parties. The two parties fought against each other. Each of them appealed to a mass constituency. Jefferson, for the most part, did not do that. The parties, both the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, as Jefferson's party was usually called, the Federalists were the party of John Adams and before that Alexander Hamilton, were parties of notables. They're parties of men of education and standing and usually some wealth. And this was really an elite quarrel more than anything else. And one good example of that is 1800, which is an election which so many people out there might know about. It was a very hard-fought election between the incumbent John Adams, the Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican. only 10% of eligible voters voted in that election. That was 67,000 people voted in the epochal election of 1800. Some people call it the Revolution of 1800 because it put into power this new party, the Democratic Republicans. And Jefferson gave a famous line he spoke in his inaugural address in 1801. He said, "We're all Federalists, we're all Republicans." And some people argue, well, that was really talking about we should all come together now after this brutal campaign that was waged. Well, actually, what I came to believe, based on a lot of research about that period, is that really what he was saying is, we're really all Republicans now. That is, we're really all part of my party now. We should all come together. In fact, even later than that, while he was president, a few years later, he basically said, these Federalists are basically just want to bring the British back. They're traitors, so we're happy that they're losing voters. And so really the coming of a mass party with a mass press, with canvassing voters all around the country to get out the vote, the kind of parties that we're used to today really doesn't happen until the 1820s, when you have something close to universal white manhood suffrage for the first time. In 1800, only men with property, white men with property could vote almost everywhere. There are very few places where white men without property who did not pay taxes on that property could vote. And so that's why I think it's a myth to see Thomas Jefferson as the father of his party. On the other hand, it's a useful myth because Jefferson, as people know out there probably, had a lot of lines. He was a very quotable guy, and the lines that are quoted, if you go to the Jefferson Memorial downtown Washington, next to the Potomac River here, most of those lines are about democracy. They're about equal rights. They're about free speech and free exercise of religion. He's the father of the Bill of Rights, after all. And so he was very quotable, imperishable truths he could utter. And the Democratic Party based itself on those ideals, even though the party that they organized was not a party that Jefferson would have recognized.
The founder, or is certainly one of the most important founders, was a president of the United States, but as a person who's not well known, though I lived in Washington D.C. at the corner of 7th Street and Van Buren Street. Tell us a bit about Martin Van Buren.
Yes, I think there's a street named after every president in Washington, D.C., even the terrible ones, like Tyler and others. So, well, Martin Van Buren, again, I'll give a very thumbnail sketch. He was a tavern owner's son from upstate New York, a place called Old Kinderhook, New York. He's the only American president.
Uh-oh.
The key builder of the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party that I mentioned before. He put together people from his machine in New York State called the Albany Regency, together with old Jeffersonians from Virginia. And they managed to put together what's called the Jackson Party. And he's the one who connected newspapers in every major state to the Democratic Party. He's the one who instituted the spoil system, to make sure that if you were a loyal party member, you had a good chance of getting a job in the federal government or as a postmaster, for example. So one of the things I focus on in this book, more than the presidents, we don't know about the presidents. The presidential biographies are very popular, and some people write many volumes, like Robert Caro, many volumes of them. But to me, the important figures in the history of a party are those who actually build the party, its organization, who define its ideology. And Martin Van Buren was that figure for the Democratic Party for the first iteration of the Democratic Party in the 1820s and 1830s. And as a president, he was a failure. But as a party builder, he was quite a success.
You're indeed, in your book, you do focus on a wide range of figures, not just the presidents, but you do talk about the presidents a good bit too. And jumping ahead, there's one president in particular who, I would like for you to discuss, probably the most important Democratic president of the 20th century, FDR. What should people, when people hear FDR, what should they be thinking? What are the central things to know about FDR and his place in the history of the Democratic Party?
Well, again, obviously people know about the New Deal policies, which are obviously very important, and many of them still exist today, of course, and endure, like Social Security. Some endure, like the Wagner Act, National Labor Relations Act, with many many carve-outs that have been made over the years that have weakened it.
By the way, I think that a lot of people actually don't know about even the New Deal. They know about it as a slogan, but I think that there is a generational challenge. Frankly, I think that there are a lot of people. I bet that there are people in this audience listening right now who really don't know very much about FDR and his legislative achievements. So I would say do a little bit of unpacking.
Okay, great. Well, the New Deal was the most aggressive expansion of the federal government, I think, in American history, and set the stage for future expansions in many ways. And unlike some other expansions, say under Wilson or even under Reconstruction, under Republicans early in the middle of the 19th century, it was really an attempt to build something like something close to a European-style welfare state. They never got as far as welfare states in places like Germany or the Netherlands or France or Scandinavia. And it included creating jobs with the Works Progress Administration, Public Works Administration, Civilian Conservation Corps. It built huge government projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority. But what was important, I can list many other New Deal agencies, we haven't got time, but what was important about it, I think, is that, again, thinking about the Democratic Party, these programs were intended, of course, to help Americans, but also to build a much larger coalition, I think an interracial coalition, even though Jim Crow still existed in the country, of course, not just in the South, even though because the Southern Democrats were still a very important part of the Democratic Party, and Roosevelt himself was not, exactly, free of prejudice. There were no civil rights bills. There were no attempts. There was an attempt to pass an anti-lynching bill, which was filibustered in the Senate, so it never came up for a vote. And what FDR was trying to do, and which the legacy he leaves to the Democratic Party as an institution, I think, is that it's a party of many different parts, a party of most intellectuals, I should say. Liberal intellectuals begin to be Democrats instead of something else, really, in the 1930s in a major way, academics especially. And by the way, most undergraduates at Harvard in the 1930s were Republicans, but most of their professors were Democrats. Interesting. And also he was trying, and also he put together this coalition, which included organized labor in a major way for the first time. As I mentioned before, organized labor pushed its way in to the party. It needed the protection of the federal government as much as the federal government needed the votes of union members, but this really he I think helped to beginning a pivot of the Democratic Party away from being this racist party to being more of an interracial party. For the first time in the 1930s, African Americans who could vote or who were able to vote, which is mostly those in the North, for the first time in 1936 voted for Democrats instead of the party of Lincoln, which they voted for ever since they'd had the vote after the Civil War. And that's never changed on a national level, at least. And also, the Democrats, he I think, makes clear that this Democratic Party is going to be the party of the working person, regardless of region, regardless of race, and also uses what you could call left-wing populist rhetoric, economic populist rhetoric to great advantage, I think. Talks about the economic royalists who were supporting the Republican Party. It's under Roosevelt that a working man, I forget, from somewhere in the Midwest, writes to Roosevelt, and pardon my language, says, "This is the first president of my life who realizes my boss is a son of a bitch." And that sense that Democrats are the party of the working person had not sometimes been true before, but for the most part, both parties tried to make that point. And that was quite valuable. And that, in a sense, I think was what undergirded the dominance of the Democratic Party for really 30 to 40 years after he was first elected in 1932.
Mm-hmm. There is a figure in your book that really jumped out at me because it seems that this figure, and who I have in mind, is Hubert Humphrey.
Mm-hmm.
So Hubert Humphrey, you mention in your book that for most of your life, you've been sort of to the left, on the leftward edge of the Democratic Party, but you've mainly been a Democrat. But there have been a few times when you did not vote the presidential standard bearer in an election, presidential election. And you mentioned Hubert Humphrey being a person that you did not vote for. Yet when you introduce Hubert Humphrey in your narrative, he's introduced with tremendous promise. And he really is, when you introduce him, he really comes off as very much of a hero. And then as the narrative proceeds, it's really a sad narrative. Tell us the story, or at least it's got to be compressed, obviously, but what are the essentials about Hubert Humphrey for your history of the Democratic Party?
Well, Hubert Humphrey, I think, is a great object lesson in the perils of ambition in politics. He comes on the scene nationally to most people, and in the book too, in 1948 at the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia, where he gives a bravura speech supporting a civil rights plank in the Democratic platform, which was a minority plank at the time. But the speech is so effective that Harry Truman, the president, who's running for election as president, who became president when FDR died, tells his assistants in the party, well, we have to support the civil rights plank now, even though we're going to lose the white South if we do it. And there's a walkout by some white Southern delegates, including the infamous Bill Connor from Alabama, and they form a states' rights party ticket that year and win some electoral votes from Southern states. Hubert Humphrey then goes on to be a liberal anti-communist senator, but very much associated with supporting civil rights, very much pro-labor candidate, supports a full employment bill, for example. And really wants to take the New Deal one step further, I think, towards something much more towards what you might call European social democracy. But then he becomes vice president, and only becomes vice president because he has successfully steered the Civil Rights Bill of '64 through Congress. But then at the convention of '64, he does Lyndon Johnson's bidding. And haven't got time to go into this, but Professor Kennedy is quite well aware of this, and maybe other folks there are as well. He tries to convince the civil rights movement party, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, to accept a demeaning compromise. The MFDP, as it was called, wanted to unseat the all-white segregationist Democratic Party delegates and seat themselves in their places as an interracial delegation, and they were offered 2 seats, and that's it. And they refused and went back home to organize in Mississippi. Humphrey tried to sell them on this, and then for his services, he was given the vice presidential nod by LBJ. And what that meant, once LBJ was elected in his landslide in 1964, was not just that Humphrey was able to help push some of the great society bills through Congress, like the Voting Rights Bill and Immigration Reform Bill and Medicare, but more and more Johnson administration got consumed by the issue of the Vietnam War. And by 1968, when Humphrey runs for president himself, the Democratic Party is torn apart by the issue of the Vietnam War. And actually, I went to Chicago to not attend that convention, but to protest against that convention, and was arrested there as a member of SDS. And, as a lifelong Democrat, well, I was only 20 at the time, but as a lifelong Democrat up to that point, I couldn't stomach, supporting a candidate who was still defending the horrible war in Vietnam. So, and Humphrey, if you look at one of the things I didn't know about until I started to do the research on this book, even though, of course, I lived through this period, if you look at the platform of the Democratic Party in 1968, it's an amazingly left-wing platform. It goes beyond the New Deal, goes beyond anything that goes beyond even Build Back Better, the perhaps doomed bill that Joe Biden Democrats have tried to pass this year or late last year. It really is including national health insurance for everybody and public housing, guaranteed job for everybody, and on and on and on. But nobody really cared about or even knew about that platform in 1968 because the only issue is the war. And Hubert Humphrey, without the war, who knows, probably would have, or perhaps if he'd broken from Johnson in the war, probably would have been elected, maybe, but he lost because the party was split in two. And when your party is split in two, and this goes for the Republicans as well, that party does not win a presidential election.
I have more questions. I want to say to the audience, if you have a question, shoot it to me in the question box. Happy to voice them, but just a few more before I go to the audience.
I'll try to be shorter than I have been.
No, you've been fine.
Well, the problem with the college professors, you turn us on, and 75 minutes later you turn us off. So and we've only got about half an hour left, a little less. So
just a couple more from me. One, the race question is very central throughout your book. And that, against that backdrop, I want to mention, or I want you to discuss, a person who figures in your narrative. And again, it's a person who I think a lot of people have probably, he's gone out of memory to a large degree, I think, for many people. Adam Clayton Powell. You have, in fact, a chapter heading, Mr. Civil Rights, Adam Clayton Powell. What's the significance of Adam Clayton Powell in the history of the Democratic Party?
First of all, Adam Clayton Powell was a minister and the son of a minister, and the church he was ministered to in Harlem was actually not just the largest church in Harlem, it was the largest church in the United States at the time. Abyssinian Baptist Church, 138th Street, still around. You can still go there, of course. And Adam Clayton Powell was an interesting figure. Again, I'll be short about it. On the one hand, he was, I'm not sure he was Mr. Civil Rights, as Professor Kennedy mentioned before we got on here, Thurgood Marshall should probably have that title, or maybe Martin Luther King Jr. But he was often called Mr. Civil Rights at the time, and certainly he was in the Congress, I think it's fair to say. He was the first Black Democrat ever elected to the House from New York State, and he served almost 30 years in Congress. And he really was a fascinating figure in the party, I think, because I call him sort of Mr. Inside and Mr. Outside at the same time. On the inside, the Democratic caucus, we had a very safe seat. He pushed what was called the Powell Amendment. He tried to attach an amendment to every federal funding bill that you could not be funded in the South, especially unless you had integrated facilities. And of course, that was not happening in the South. The amendment was always tabled, of course, or died in the Senate. But everyone knew about the Powell Amendment and knew who Powell was because of that Powell Amendment. But at the same time, he also spoke to rallies. Lots of times. He spoke in a rally in my hometown, Englewood, New Jersey, for integrated housing and integrated schools. He supported Black Power at a time when not very many Democrats, Black or white, were supporting Black Power. So he wanted to be a man of the people, a man of the movement. At the same time, he wanted to be a powerful figure, and was a powerful figure in many ways inside the party. So his personal life was kind of a mess. I won't go into that. You can read the book about that. But he was really, I think, the most powerful Black Democrat at the time in the history of the party, and helped, I think, to define what the party would mean on civil rights policy in many ways, and also helped, I think, to sell the party to many times to many Black Americans who, for understandable reasons, were very dubious about it. And he did something very daring in 1956 when the Democratic Party was sort of going backward on civil rights after the Brown v. Board of Education ruling. Adlai Stevenson was Democratic nominee that year, and he was sort of mealy-mouthed about the civil rights policy because he didn't want to lose the white South. So Powell did something very kind of daring. He supports a Republican for president. He supports Dwight D. Eisenhower for president. Now, it wasn't so daring because everyone knew Eisenhower was going to win anyway, but with the fact that he broke with his party and, the kind of thing, sort of Lynn Cheney has done today in some ways, but he got a primary challenger, but he just rode roughshod over the primary challenger. He was so popular. And also he was supporting Eisenhower because Eisenhower, he thought, was doing more for civil rights, sending troops into Little Rock, et cetera, than Stevenson was. And so this was a protest vote, so to speak. And then, he was so popular that he was invited right back into the party after the election was over.
Okay. I'm going to go to a few of the questions that are coming in from our audience. Here's one. Is the new Democrat era of Clinton to Obama over?
I think Obama was beginning to end that period. He was ambivalent about it. By the way, new Democrat, I think the questioner means to reference the move to the right of the party on economic policy, especially on being a strong pro-union party, associated with the Democratic Leadership Council, which Bill Clinton was the president of for a while, right before he got elected president in 1992, or what some would call the neoliberal turn, whether or not you accept that phrase or not. I think in terms of doctrine, in terms of program, definitely. As many people pointed out, the policies that the House has passed already, even somewhat slimmed down, Build Back Better plans, the Voting Rights Bill, the PRO Act, which would make it much easier to organize unions than the current Wagner Act does, all of which would go, past what the Democrats have done since the Great Society, since the 1960s, in terms of policy. And I think Democratic coalition is a more left-wing coalition. All the people who got excited by Bernie Sanders, by Elizabeth Warren, who now consider themselves Democrats, and even some who call themselves socialists, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who run as Democrats. So the base of the party, I think, ideologically, in many ways, has moved to the left. The problem, of course, is that Democrats have such narrow majorities, and Joe Biden is not a popular president. And so it's possible, though I hope doesn't happen, that Biden will feel like he has to move to the center, or try to be perceived as moving to the center in order to stop the bleeding in his popularity, and of course to try to keep both houses of Congress, at least one house of Congress, in Democratic hands. But such a there's almost no between the two parties. Each party has to try, of course, to keep everybody in the party happy, and that's very hard to do because there are still many Democrats, of course, who, whether ideologically centrist or moderate, whatever you call them, New Democrat, as the questioner calls them, or not, they have to win election in places that either voted for Donald Trump or came very close to voting for Donald Trump. And that's electorally, that's always a problem. You can't run too far to the left of your district or you're going to lose.
A couple of days ago, you wrote a piece in the New York Times, an op-ed, extracted from your book, in which you have the following. You say the following. What the Democratic Party needs is a message that can unite ordinary Americans across racial lines. What's that message?
Well, I think it's some of the things I've been talking about, and I talk about it in the piece. That is, universal programs that help everybody, as equally as certainly possible. I mean, what's the contradiction out there for Democrats, I think, for progressive Democrats like myself, and maybe some of the people here in the audience, is that a lot of the ideas that they support are very popular, actually. Look at polls. Universal pre-K is popular. Giving payments to families with small children, as was done for a while during the pandemic and then was cut off, is popular. Aggressive action on climate change is also popular, which might be surprising to some people. Unions are very popular. Unions are more popular than they've been since the mid-1960s, when the unions were much larger, for example. All these, and covering everyone with healthcare, and covering old folks like me with dental care and hearing care is also popular under Medicare. All these social democratic programs or welfare state programs, which are very popular across racial lines, and even some Republicans like them. The problem, of course, is getting them through, and the problem, of course, is building a movement of working people, lower middle class, middle class people, whatever you call them, people who don't have a lot of money, who don't have a lot of savings, to push those bills. And the problem throughout American history, whenever the Democrats have embraced these programs or programs like them, not these exact programs, of course, there's been a movement that's pushed them. And Democrats are, like all politicians, are very practical. If they're going to win election, many of them saying one thing, they'll say that. If they can win election saying something else, they'll say that. If they can win election by moving to the center, they'll say that. If they can win election by moving to the left, they'll say that. I'm not saying they're prostitutes politically, but they want to win. They want to hold off so they can get things done, which is the positive side of that. But they need to be pressed by movement. And right now, unfortunately, and I don't mean to be a pessimist, my friend Miles Rappaport out there is always an optimist, and I love to listen to him because he lifts my spirits and my hopes. But right now, we haven't got the movement that we need. Democrats don't have the movement they need. So too much of what the Democrats do is top down, saying this will be good for you. But the people who will be good for have to be organizing themselves. And for a lot of the 20th century, the institution to do that were labor unions. Labor unions, as everyone out there probably knows, are not doing very well now, unless with the exception of public workers' unions. And that's the problem. Politicians need to be pushed.
Two questions. One, you talk about universal themes, but isn't it true that there is an important constituency within the Democratic camp that demands racial specificity? So, for instance, if we're talking about public policy with respect to the virus, it's not enough, according to some, to talk about public policy with respect to the virus for everyone. There needs to be a focus on those who have been historically marginalized, Black and brown people. And one could replicate that over and over and over again. In fact, in your discussion of LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, I thought you had a very interesting analysis with respect to Johnson. It seemed to me that you were somewhat critical of Johnson by him not being universalistic enough. So that you said, the one difficulty with Johnson was when it was great that Johnson was behind the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was great that Johnson was behind the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was great that Johnson was, an anti-poverty man. But you said the problem with that was that there were so many people who basically said, well, oh, that's well and nice, but that's for those folks over there. What's he doing for moi? So there is this tension. How are Democrats supposed to navigate that?
Well, that's one of the toughest questions in the country. And look, it's been one of the toughest questions in U.S. history, obviously. If you have programs that are perceived, at least, as mostly or even only helping, people who aren't white, especially African Americans or Latinos, Asian Americans, say affirmative action, for example, then you're doing something, I think, which is moral. You're doing something which is right. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Open Housing Law of the 1960s were a long time coming, and they only could pass because Democrats had huge majorities. They didn't need white Southerners in their party to vote for it, and they got some Republican votes as well. The problem is, as you said, majority of the country is white, right? And is now less than it used to be, but still 70% or something. And especially working people who are white, do want to say, well, if the government's doing is not for us, why should we be for that government? And that's the rude, unfortunate reality, of American politics. I wish it were otherwise. I wish more Americans thought like the abolitionists. I thought more Americans thought like we have to solve these historic wrongs, and that should be our major occupation. But in the end, we're a democracy, and that means that the people get to decide. And the people, if they think that critical race theory is being taught to kindergartners, which of course is absurd, but they're not hearing what the government, what Joe Biden's administration is going to do for them. And Joe Biden is not very good at being a communicator. I hate to say, Barack Obama was much better at being a communicator, though he didn't communicate a lot of these programs. Then they're not going to win their votes. And if you don't win their votes, in the end, you're not going to be able to help, people of color either. And that's the problem. You need, one of my favorite books in recent years is Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us, where she makes the argument, as people know, and Miles knows her, very well, makes the argument that anti-racism is good for white people too, because white people who support racist candidates are basically hurting themselves, cutting their own throats, because they're not supporting labor unions, more universal programs that should help them too, because they think, oh, those are only programs liberals want to help, Black people with those programs. I agree with her, but that argument itself is not being made by very many Democrats, unfortunately. Heather McGhee is not, there in the cabinet making that argument, which I think she can make very well. So that's the problem, and it's a problem that you can only deal with by talking about racism and about how people of color need help the most, but everybody needs help too, and these programs will help all these people who need help, and that I think is a political problem. The Democrats are a very heterogeneous coalition, more than the Republicans are. Republicans, despite picking up some Latinx votes in the last couple of elections, are still primarily a party of white Christians. Democrats are much the party of Jews, Muslims, Christians of different denominations. They're a party more of recent immigrants than Republicans are. So it's tough to keep a heterogeneous party like this together around the same program. But for me, programs that promote a vision of moral capitalism would be those programs. But maybe we should time for some more questions, probably, right? From the
we got some good ones. Here's an iteration of a question that I think that you were just dealing with, but there are a bunch of questions that are like this. Question: how did the Democratic Party stop being perceived by many workers as the bastion of support for working class interests? How did that happen?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's a complicated question. First of all, I think again, I get to be a broken record when there were broken records. That's an outdated metaphor, but a broken Zoom link about this. But I think there's no getting around the fact that most working people thought the party was their party because a large minority of working people were in labor unions or in the families of people who were in labor unions, and labor unions push the Democratic Party to be more pro-labor, to be more for these New Deal programs and Great Society programs, those that did help working people. And as unions shrank, especially in the private sector, a lot of people then, first of all, when a lot of jobs began to leave, the country to go overseas in the 70s and 80s, The base of the Democratic Party and the base of most of the trade unions was in the so-called Rust Belt, which was not a Rust Belt originally, of course. And so Democrats were in power in a lot of the states. They were often in power in the federal government as well when that began to happen. And so a lot of those people felt, well, you were supposed to be in my party. What happened to these jobs? They weren't overseas. Or they went down south sometimes, to areas where labor unions were not present. So that was part of what happened. And also, someone asked before, the so-called New Democrats, Democratic Leadership Council, the original neoliberals, actually, they were called originally in the 1980s, believed that Democrats had lost to Ronald Reagan. They lost to George H.W. Bush because they were too friendly to labor. They thought labor is too friendly a special interest, and Democrats had to be a party that was friendly to business, friendly to the beginnings of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs in general, and so ideas that Democrats had, like the Humphrey-Hawkins full employment bill, which one of the last things Hubert Humphrey did before he died of cancer in the 1970s was he promotes a bill with Augustus Hawkins, a Black congressman from Los Angeles, to basically have the federal government be the employer of last resort. If you can't find a job, given the way the economy is, then the federal government will create a job, which was pretty popular in polls again at the time. But Jimmy Carter said, forget that. I'm not going to support that. And that was one example of the kind of legislation Democrats might have stood for, which would have given a lot of white working people maybe a sense that this was still their party.
Have cultural issues become more important than economic issues in the Democratic Party's current difficulty in appealing to working class voters?
I think so.
What can the Democrats do about that?
Yeah, well, it depends on the issue, of course. I talked about, racial issues. I think, I laid out a tentative idea of what they could try to do at least. But also, I think, some issues cannot be compromised. Abortion in the end can't be compromised. Now I think the Democrats should, and this be controversial, maybe some people out there. I think Democrats should say, if you're pro-life, we're not going to shut you out of the party. That's not our policy. We support abortion rights, but Robert Casey, Democratic senator from Pennsylvania, is pro-life. He doesn't talk about it much, but I think there were honest, moral people who think abortion is murder, and they're not going to support Roe v. Wade. And I think they should, if they support other Democratic policies, I think they should be allowed to be in the party, though they're not going to set policy. But other cultural issues, are going to be difficult. And I think Democrats have to be able to explain better than they have so far, why, for example, this issue of critical race theory is a crock,
Yes, let me interrupt. Yeah. That's a key. Obviously, the governor's race in Virginia, very important race. This was a key issue. So you're a historian. What should Democrats say with respect to the cultural wars, particularly the historiographical cultural wars, whether it be critical race theory, whether it be the 1619 Project? What should Democrats say in response to the attacks on that, front, that part of the cultural front?
I think Democrats should say actually what Frederick Douglass said in some ways in his great speech, What to a Slave is the 4th of July. He basically said, we have great ideals in this country, but woefully, he said it a little more angrily than I will. Of course, he was under slavery, but he said, Declaration of Independence, the Constitution are great documents. They have in them a lot of what we need to make this country a much better country. But those in power have not, been true to those ideals, not been true to those possibilities and those opportunities and that promise. Daniel Allen has a great book on Declaration of Independence, for example, called Our Declaration, which makes a somewhat analogous case that the Declaration of Independence is about equality. Even though a lot of people who were involved in writing it, like Thomas Jefferson, were enslavers. So I think it's the gap. Democrats can talk, and progressives, I think, in general, should talk about the gap between the ideals of the country, which are wonderful ideals I subscribe to, make me a patriot, actually, because of those ideals, and the ways in which America, sometimes, often has fallen short. And but people have fought for those ideals, and so the critical race theory people passing these laws around the country right now are saying, you can't teach divisive concepts. I'll say, look, Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, those are not divisive documents, right? They're founding documents of the country. So, but what does it mean to be all men are created equal? What does it mean to have due process of law under the 14th Amendment? What does it mean that everybody, should be able to vote, by the 15th Amendment, except for race, previous condition of servitude, or incarceration? What do these things mean? What should they really mean? Let's carry them out in practice. Anyway, that's my little spiel on that. And, will it work? No. I think a lot of what happened in Virginia, actually, my son's a Democratic Party operative, I should say. He says it's more about masking the schools and virtual education. And, in the polls the Democrats did afterwards, they found critical race theory didn't really matter to most people. In fact, a recent poll shows that most people disagree with Glenn Youngkin, the new governor there, on that issue. They just were pissed off that Democrats had made it difficult for their kids to go to school. And that made the difference in the 2%, gap between Youngkin and Chair McAuliffe.
We've talked about a number of people. I want you to talk about
I think
one.
we just have 3 more minutes. So
we do. No, you have to be quick on this, but yeah. I do want to mention a person, very important person in the Democratic Party, very important person in the history of the Democratic Party. And she's very much on my mind, given that, midterms are coming up. And that's Nancy Pelosi. What do you say about Nancy Pelosi and her contribution to the history of the Democratic Party?
Well, first of all, a great party builder. She helped Democrats win the majority in 2006 election, helped them win the majority again in 2018. And of course, got to be Speaker of the House, because the Democrats did win back the majority. And also, she's an incredible fundraiser. She does 300 fundraisers a year at age 80 or 81. And I think she's just she does what you want a Speaker of the House to do. She manages to get her caucus together. I mean, look at this narrow majority. They have a 5-seat majority base. If the Republicans win 5 seats this fall, or maybe 6, they will win control of the Congress. But she got all these bills through, through this very narrow majority. That is what a party builder and a party leader does. Whatever you think of her policies, that's not important. What's important is she knows how to win. And that's what the book's about.
Listen, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you so much for not just this book, but many books and columns, op-eds, and various interventions over the years. I've certainly benefited tremendously from your observations. I hope that many people will read your book. It certainly comes at a telling moment, let us say. Tonight, the State of the Union address, there is this ominous war in Europe. There is the, we in America, January 6th insurrection is everything that has come from it still very much on our front pages. And then there are these elections that are coming up. So you've written this history of the Democratic Party at a really quite remarkable moment in American history. I hope that people will read it and will enjoy it and will learn from it. Thank you so much. And thank you very much, our sponsors. And I hope that everybody will be well.